Today we are talking about movement terminology. This is the foundation for everything that we do from here on out. Whenever we discuss muscles and their actions, we are going to be using this movement terminology. So we want to spend some time learning these terms and what they mean. We are talking about page 23, 24, 25 in your trail guide book. And I'm not going to do a screen share because I want you to be able to see me as I demonstrate these movements. So the very first thing that we need to understand is that all of these movements are based on something called anatomical position. Anatomical position is standing straight up and down, feet flat on the floor, arms out to the sides, completely erect, palms facing forward. Move the chair out of the way. And I know this is going to be difficult to see because I can only back up so far here, but anatomical position looks like this. See, my palms are facing forward, and you can imagine that my feet are on the floor, my knees are facing forward, my feet are facing forward. This is anatomical position. So all of the movements that we talk about are based on this starting position. So let's talk about flexion and extension. Flexion is decreasing the angle of a joint or bringing two bones closer together. So if I decrease the angle of this joint, I'm going to bend my elbow like this. I'm bringing two bones closer together. I'm decreasing the angle of this joint. This is flexion. Okay? Now, flexion and extension are opposites. So in anatomical position, every joint in the body is in extension. So these are all straight and elongated. My spine is straight and elongated. My legs are straight. Okay, everything is in full extension in anatomical position. So we do flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow, flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow. So if flexion is bringing two bones together or decreasing the angle of a joint, then extension is taking two bones farther apart or increasing the angle of a joint. So this straight line here is 180 degrees if we're talking about angles, and this would be roughly 90 degrees, okay? So I can do that anywhere on the body, okay? So I was doing the elbow, flexion of the wrist, extension of the wrist, flexion of the neck, extension of the neck, flexion of the torso, extension of the torso, flexion of the hip. You see how I'm decreasing the angle of this joint right now? Extension of the hip. Okay, so flexion and extension are opposites. Flexion brings the bones closer together. Extension takes them farther apart or increases the angle of a joint. And I have my half of an arm here. We have a humerus bone, and then we have an ulna, but we don't have the radius with it. But I can just demonstrate this way as well. So in anatomical position, all the bones are straight, right? Their angle is roughly 180 degrees. In flexion, we're bringing the bones closer together, okay? Extension, oops, flexion, okay? And that's flexion and extension and how those work. Now, I'm gonna back up again. So you can see, back to anatomical position. And of course we have our skeleton here, but he is just hanging out at the moment. We'll use him a little bit later. Okay, so in anatomical position, we also have abduction and adduction. Abduction, abduction, and adduction, adduction. I will try to enunciate because it is only one letter difference, but they mean opposite things. So in anatomical position, if I bring a joint closer to the midline of the body, that is adduction, adduction, because I'm adding to the body. I'm bringing my arms closer to the body. Okay, bringing a joint or a limb closer to the midline of the body is adduction. Okay, this is the midline, right where my buttons are. Adduction. And this is really for arms and legs, okay? Adduction. Now, if I take my arm or my leg away from the midline of the body, like this, that is abduction, abduction. We do it with my leg too, abduction, abduction, abduction. Like someone is abducted, they are taken away from where they were. That's how you can remember those. So adduction is adding to the body. Abduction is taking away from the midline. Okay, and like I said, those are used for the arms and the legs. So we can also do adduction of the wrists and abduction of the wrists. Adduction, adduction, I'm adding to the body, so I'm bringing closer to the midline. Abduction, I'm taking them further away from the midline. Okay. And again, can use that for the legs as well, but you can't really see my legs very well, so just pretend they're going out in abduction and back in adduction, bringing them closer to the midline of the body. Okay, now I'm going to get a little closer to the screen. You won't be able to see my head, but you'll be able to see my shoulder. We have medial and lateral rotation. So medial and lateral rotation refer to something rotating closer to the midline or something rotating further away from the midline. So in the case of the shoulder, which is what they're showing in your book on page 23, okay, I'll bend it, I'll make it look exactly like it does in the book. I'm going to rotate my shoulder joint toward the midline. Now you can't really see my shoulder joint rotating very well, but you can see the result when my arm moves towards the midline. Lateral rotation of my shoulder joint takes my arm away from the midline in rotation. So watch the shoulder. Medial rotation, lateral rotation. Okay, I don't have to bend my elbow for this, but you can see it more clearly. You can see the results of the rotation more clearly with my elbow bent. If I keep my arm straight in anatomical position, I can still do medial and lateral rotation. It just looks a little different. So here's medial rotation. See, this is the result of the medial rotation here, and lateral rotation. Medial rotation, lateral rotation. See, all I'm doing is rotating this joint, okay? You can do that with your hips as well. Again, I'm not really in a position to show medial and lateral rotation with my hip, but maybe I can tilt this down a little, okay? So medial rotation of the hip is going to go towards the midline. So if I bend my knee and I do medial rotation, you can see like this, it's kind of the same as showing it with the elbow here. And lateral rotation is this. Medial rotation, lateral rotation. If the hip is flexed, I don't have to have the hip flexed. I can just do medial rotation where my knee kind of points in toward the midline, and lateral rotation where my knee points away from the midline. Medial rotation, lateral rotation. And again, I am flexing my hip a little bit just so you can see how my leg is moving, but I don't have to do that. I can just medially and laterally rotate it like this. Just for demonstration purposes. Okay, so I can also, There we go. I need an assistant is really what it comes down to. I need a cameraman. Okay. So rotation in general is, rotating around a point versus flexion, which is on what plane? What plane does flexion occur on? Flexion and extension? Right, the sagittal plane, flexion and extension. Rotation occurs along what plane? That's right, the transverse plane. So I can rotate any part of my body. We were just doing medial and lateral rotation, specifically of the shoulder and the hip, but I can rotate any place along my spine, okay? So I can do rotation of the head and neck to the left, rotation of the head and neck to the right. I can rotate my torso to the left. I can rotate my torso to the right, okay? And that's just rotation. It doesn't have a medial and a lateral attached to it because we are along the midline, okay? Rotation, 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 rotation. All right, so we have abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, rotation, medial and lateral rotation. So now we talk about circumduction, because circumduction, which is on page 24, is actually a combination of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, okay? And this is what it looks like. Okay, the circumduction is a combination of things. So we have flexion, we have the extension. Well, the extension is going to be back here a little bit. We actually have a little bit of abduction, and then we have a little bit of adduction, and it's all one smooth movement called circumduction. And this takes place at the glenohumeral joint, which is your shoulder joint here. Okay, so circumduction. There we go. It's better if you use sound effects. Okay, so I can actually sit down for the others at the moment. And I'm going to need to so that you can see these a little more closely. Lateral flexion. Lateral flexion takes place along the coronal plane, and it is the same as flexion in which you are decreasing the angle of a joint, but lateral flexion takes place along the spine. So if I go like this, I am laterally flexing my head and neck to the right. So see, I have decreased the angle here. Remember, in anatomical position, everything is in full extension. All I'm doing is flexing to one side. That's lateral flexion, okay? And I can do the same thing with my whole spine if I, bend essentially to the right. We don't use the term bend anymore. We use the term lateral flexion. So lateral flexion to the left, lateral flexion to the right. Okay. I can do the same thing with my torso. All right, that's just lateral flexion. It happens along the spine. We have elevation and depression. Again, these are opposites. Elevation is when a bone is going to move towards the ceiling, and depression is when a bone is going to move towards the floor in its natural joint movement. So they give examples of the scapula and the mandible. If I open my mouth, I am depressing the mandible. So the mandible is moving towards the floor. If I close my mouth, so I'm going this direction, that is elevation of the mandible. So depression, elevation. It's hard to do while speaking. Depression, moving towards the floor, elevation, moving towards the ceiling. Our scapulas, which are here, it's this big bone back here. Remember, you probably know it as your shoulder blade, but we're going to call it the scapula from here on out. The scapula can move towards the ceiling, and it can move towards the floor. So towards the ceiling is Right, elevation towards the floor is depression. Right, exactly. So elevation, depression. We can do that at the scapula. We can do that at the mandible. Now, we also have supination and pronation. Supination and pronation are specific to the forearm, and this is where we get our skeleton involved. Okay, so if you take a look at the forearm here, because apparently my other forearm is missing a bone, we have these two bones right here. They are parallel to one another. This is the radius right here. This is the ulna right here. If I put my forearm out like this to match his, you can see that the bones are parallel here. Actually, I need to turn him around a little. There we go. The bones are parallel to one another. The arm is straight, palm outstretched, okay? In the forearm, something really unique happens. If I take the radius bone right here and I go like this, I have now just crossed it over top of the ulna. So I'll show that again. I'll reposition it. Reposition the radius. And now the radius and the ulna are parallel. And then right now I'm going to move the radius over the ulna. See? Like that. This is the only place in the body where one bone actually crosses over another. And this is what supination and pronation are. So supination is in this position where you are maybe holding a bowl of soup. So the radius and the ulna are parallel. Pronation is where you cross the radius over the ulna and the palm will be face down, which he doesn't have a palm exactly, but if you see, his fingers are pointing towards the floor, okay? And the radius is crossed over the ulna in this position. So I'm gonna go back to supination. Palm is towards the ceiling, holding a bowl of soup. Radius and the ulna are parallel. And then again, pronation, where the radius crosses over the ulna and the palm is now facing the floor. In your book, it shows turning a doorknob, because that's really how you use supination and pronation. So supination, if I'm turning the doorknob this way, pronation, if I'm turning the doorknob this way. Either way, in supination and pronation, the radius is going to cross over the ulna and then reposition so that it's parallel to the ulna. Okay, like I said, the only place in the body where one bone crosses over another. What else do we have here? Let's talk about protraction, retraction, deviation, and opposition before we get to the movements that are specific to the foot and ankle. So on page 25, we have protraction and retraction. Protraction is when a bone moves forward away from the body, and retraction is when a bone moves back towards the body. So we're talking about primarily the jaw, but also the clavicle, which can go forward and back. But in protraction and retraction, we're pretty much in this class going to stick to the jaw. So protraction, protraction makes you look like a monster. So the mandible is moving forward. Retraction is just when I bring it back. Protraction, retraction. Okay? Protraction, retraction. Okay, pro is moving it forward, re is moving it back. And again, retraction is going to typically move it back into its original position because it can't go any further than that. But in the case of the clavicle, this is the clavicle, right? Clavicle's right here, it goes forward and the whole shoulder girdle has to come with it, and then it goes backwards into retraction. So protraction, retraction. As far as deviation is concerned, we have lateral deviation, usually when a bone goes side to side. So in the case of the mandible, we can go side to side. That's lateral deviation because it's moving laterally away from the midline. So we have a lot of movements of the mandible. Okay. That's deviation, sometimes called lateral deviation. Opposition is this. You've heard before that humans have opposable thumbs. That's how we do it. We oppose each digit with our thumbs, specifically the pinky, but opposition occurs at the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. And we can touch our opposite pinky is basically what that means. Okay, so this is opposition. Bloop. And really what opposition does for us is allows us to have a precision grip, which is this. Other primates, other higher order primates can grip things, don't get me wrong. And they actually have opposable thumbs. So it is not unique to humans. Yes, they do have opposable thumbs. However, whereas they can grip like this, we can grip like this. This is what's unique, is that we can do this precision grip. So we can use tools in a precise way. Like we can grab onto a pen or a pencil and we can manipulate it in that grip. So opposable thumbs, not unique to humans, but we have this lovely opposition of the pinky and can do the precision grip, which is unique. All right, so now we have movements that are specific to the foot and ankle. Inversion and eversion. These are harder typically for students to remember, and I'm going to try to push this down so you can see my lovely bare feet here. Okay, so inversion brings the sole of the foot toward the midline. So it's the sole of the foot is looking at the midline of the body. Okay, that is inversion. And technically that's called the plantar surface of the foot. Okay, plantar surface of the foot is pointing towards the midline. In eversion, it's the opposite. Okay, the sole of the foot or the plantar surface is pointing away from the midline. And your book is trying to show you this, but the illustrations are difficult to understand. So I'm showing you eversion, the plantar surface points away. Inversion, the plantar surface points towards the midline. Eversion, inversion, eversion, inversion. Now the reason that we have inversion and eversion in our ankles is for stability on uneven surfaces, so that we actually can walk on rocks and things and not fall over. You know, we do not have hooves, so we're not able to, you know, traverse different terrain real specifically. We have feet. So instead of, you know, being able to like clomp onto things like hooves do, we have to constantly readjust to maintain balance. And that's what inversion and eversion do for us, okay? We also have plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Now they're both called flexion, but they're opposites. Plantar flexion is when you put that plantar surface of your foot down towards the ground. So it's like when you point your toes or when you push down on the gas pedal. Okay, pedal to the metal is plantar flexion. Then the opposite is dorsiflexion. So that is when you take your foot off the gas pedal. The top of your foot is called the dorsal surface of your foot. It's the surface that's closest to your face. If you are bringing that up towards your face, that's dorsiflexion. So plantar flexion is pedal to the metal. Dorsiflexion is bringing your foot off the gas pedal. bringing that dorsal surface of the foot towards the face, okay? And that is it for individual movement terms. Now the next, it's like 6 or 7 pages, are movements specific to each body area. Movements specific to each body area. So you will have a workbook assignment based on those pages to get you to practice this movement terminology, okay? So like I said, this particular terminology we're going to be using from here on out. So make sure you spend time with it, learn it, because when we come back to class, we will be doing some fun activities with it. So I will see you soon.